The courier arrived at exactly 9:47 in the morning, at the gates of a house so large it had its own postal code. Arjun Malhotra was standing in his glass-walled office on the 4th floor, looking down at the city he had built half his empire in, when his assistant knocked twice and said the words that would end his life as he knew it. "Sir, there's a letter for you. It's strange." "Strange how, Priya?" "The handwriting, sir, and the stamp date." He almost didn't look up from his laptop. Billionaires get strange mail every day, begging letters, threats, proposals, fraud attempts dressed as opportunities. He had a whole department that filtered these things before they ever reached his desk. But something in Priya's voice made him set the laptop aside. She placed the envelope in front of him like it might bite her. Arjun looked at it once, and then his coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor, and neither he nor Priya moved to pick it up. He knew that handwriting. He had known it since before he could read it himself. The particular slant of the letter A, the way the M always looked like two small hills. It was his mother's handwriting, Kaveri Malhotra's handwriting. The problem was simple, and it was impossible. His mother had been dead for 3 years. He turned the envelope over with shaking hands. "Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started." The postmark was real, stamped, dated, processed through an actual postal facility. 2 weeks ago, not 3 years ago. 2 weeks. "Sir, are you all right?" He didn't answer her. He was staring at a small handwritten number in the corner of the envelope, the kind of detail no forger would think to fake, because no forger would know it mattered. 5 of 5. His mother had written 5 letters. This was the 5th, which meant somewhere, in some drawer, some box, some hidden place he had never been shown. 4 more letters existed. Letters written by a woman who had been in the ground for 3 years. Letters he was seeing for the first time in his life. His hands were not steady when he opened it. Inside was a single folded page. And on that page, only one line, written in the unmistakable hand of a mother who had loved her son enough to sell her own gold bangles for him. "If you are reading this, someone finally told you the truth. Ask your wife where the first 4 are." Arjun read the sentence 4 times. Each time, the words rearranged themselves into a different kind of horror. "Ask your wife." He thought of Mira downstairs at that very moment, probably reviewing menus for the charity gala she was hosting that weekend. Probably smiling the way she always smiled, warm and certain. A woman who had stood beside him at his mother's funeral 3 years ago and cried real tears. He had seen them. He had held her while she cried them. He thought of every conversation about his mother's death he had ever had with his wife. "She went peacefully, Arjun. I made sure of everything. You don't need to torture yourself. You were building the company," she understood. She was proud of you. She never blamed you for not coming. He had believed every word. He looked at the letter in his hand again. "Ask your wife where the first 4 are." Somewhere in this house, his house, the house his wife managed down to the last cushion, there were 4 letters from his dead mother that he had never been allowed to see. What had she written in them? What had his wife hidden from him for 3 years? And more than anything, one question began to burn through his chest like acid. If his wife had hidden 4 letters, what else, in 3 years of grieving a mother he thought he understood completely, had she hidden from him too? He did not call for Mira, not yet. He sat very still at his desk, the shattered coffee cup still on the floor, the 5th letter trembling slightly in his hand, and for the first time in 11 years of marriage, Arjun Malhotra felt something he had never let himself feel about his own wife. Suspicion. He sat there for a long while after Priya quietly left the room, sweeping up the broken porcelain without a word, sensing that whatever had just happened was not something she should ask about. Arjun barely noticed her leave. He was staring at the envelope, turning it over and over in his hands, as though enough turning might reveal a second message hidden somewhere in the paper itself. He thought about calling his mother's old phone number, the one he still hadn't deleted from his contacts 3 years later, some superstitious part of him unwilling to erase the last trace of her from his device. He thought about driving straight to the village where she was supposed to have died, to stand once more at the small clinic he had visited exactly once, for her memorial, and ask someone, anyone, whether the story he had been told was even true. Instead, he did something he almost never did during business hours. He closed his laptop, turned off the lights in his office, and told Priya to cancel every meeting for the rest of the day. "Sir, the board call at 2, cancel it. And the investors flying in from, Cancel everything, Priya, please. She had worked for him for 6 years, and had never once heard him cancel a board call. She didn't ask again. Alone in the dim office, Arjun read the 5th letter one more time, and then, almost involuntarily, he found himself speaking aloud to an empty room, to a mother who could no longer hear him. What didn't you tell me, Ma? The question hung in the silence, unanswered, and somewhere in his own house, 4 more answers were waiting behind a locked drawer, guarded by a woman he had never once thought to doubt. To understand how a man builds an empire and still misses the smell of his own mother's kitchen, you have to go back to a one-room rented shop on a street so narrow that 2 rickshaws couldn't pass each other without one backing up. Arjun Malhotra was 19 when he started. He had no degree from a great institution, no family business waiting to be inherited, no wealthy uncle to write him a check. What he had was a small idea about affordable electronics repair, a mother who believed in him more than she believed in anything else in the world, and a hunger that came from watching that same mother go without dinner more nights than he could count. He remembered, even now, sitting in an office with imported Italian furniture, exactly what it felt like to be 14 years old and pretend he wasn't hungry, so his mother would eat the last chapati instead of splitting it between them. He remembered telling her, "I already ate at my friend's house, Ma," when he hadn't eaten anything since morning. He remembered how she always seemed to know he was lying, and ate the chapati anyway, because turning down food would have meant admitting she knew her son was starving himself for her. And some truths are too heavy for a mother to hold in front of her child. Kaveri Malhotra never went to college. She never learned English properly, but she understood something about sacrifice that no business school could ever teach her son. And Arjun absorbed that understanding the way a plant absorbs sunlight, quietly, completely, without ever being told he was doing it. When he was 19 and needed capital to open that first small repair shop, there was no bank willing to lend a teenager money with no collateral and no credit history. His mother didn't hesitate. She went to her small steel almirah, the one she kept locked even though there was nothing valuable in the house except what was inside it, and she took out the only gold she owned, 2 bangles her own mother had given her on her wedding day, the only inheritance she had ever received in her life. "Ma, I can't take these." "You're not taking them," she told him, pressing them into his hands. "You're borrowing them. You'll buy me better ones one day." He sold those bangles for 11,000 rupees. It was enough for a rented room, a workbench, a handful of tools, and enough spare parts to start repairing broken radios and cheap mobile phones for the neighborhood. 19 years later, that one-room shop had become a technology company worth more money than Arjun could comprehend, even when he looked directly at the number. He had built it with his own hands, his own sleepless nights, his own refusal to quit, even when investors laughed him out of rooms, even when competitors tried to buy him out just to shut him down, even when the entire venture nearly collapsed twice in its first 5 years. There was a particular memory Arjun returned to more than any other, one he had never told anyone, not even Meera. He was 17, and his father, a quiet man who worked as a clerk and died young, leaving Kaveri to raise their son largely alone, had just passed away, and the small family had almost nothing left. Kaveri had taken up embroidery work late into the night, her fingers pricked and calloused, straining her eyes under a single bulb because they could not afford to run more than one light at a time. Arjun, unable to sleep, had once crept out of bed at 2 in the morning and found her still bent over the cloth, humming softly to herself to stay awake. "Ma, go to sleep, I'll help you finish it. You have school in 5 hours, Beta. You have work in 5 hours too." She had laughed, tired but genuine, and let him sit beside her, threading needles while she stitched. The two of them working in comfortable silence until the sky outside began to lighten. He never forgot the way she looked at him that night, not with pity for their circumstances, but with a kind of fierce, unshakable pride, as though she already knew, somehow, that the boy sitting beside her at 2 in the morning would grow into someone extraordinary. It was that same fierce belief that had funded his first shop, that had kept him company through failed prototypes and rejected loan applications, that had taught him more than any business school ever could, that success without integrity was simply a different kind of failure. He was, by every account that mattered, a good man. He paid his employees fairly. He funded scholarships for children from backgrounds like his own. He never forgot where he came from, or so he told himself. Every year, at every award ceremony where someone introduced him as a self-made success story. But there was one debt Arjun Malhotra had never fully repaid, and it wasn't measured in money, He had promised his mother better gold bangles. He had eventually given her a drawer full of jewelry she rarely wore. What he had never truly given her, not consistently, not without excuse, not without the promise of, "Next month, Ma, I'll come next month," was his time. And now, holding a letter from a woman 3 years dead, postmarked 2 weeks ago, Arjun Malhotra was about to discover exactly how much that unpaid debt had cost. Kaveri Malhotra was the kind of woman neighbors described, after she was gone, with the same 3 words, over and over. She never complained. Even after her son became one of the richest men in the country, even after he built her a house with marble floors and told the household staff to treat her like the mother of the owner, Kaveri kept working. Every morning at 6, before anyone else in that enormous house was awake, she would be in the kitchen, tying her old cotton sari around her waist, cutting vegetables for a breakfast she insisted on cooking herself. "Ma, we have 3 cooks," Arjun told her once, half laughing, half exasperated. "You don't need to do this." "I know I don't need to," she said, not looking up from the onions she was chopping. "I want to. Let me have this beta. If I stop working with my hands, I will start feeling like a guest in my own son's house. And a mother should never feel like a guest." He hadn't understood it then. He understood it now, sitting with a letter in his hand, wondering how much of his mother's inner life he had simply never bothered to ask about. Kaveri had a way of making everyone around her feel cared for without ever asking to be cared for in return. The driver's daughter had a fever once, and Kaveri sat up with the girl through the night, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, while the girl's own exhausted mother finally slept. The gardener's son needed school fees 1 year, and Kaveri quietly paid them from money she'd saved doing embroidery work on the side, work she never told her son about, because she knew he would insist on giving her more money than she wanted, and that wasn't the point. The point was that she wanted to give, not simply receive. There was a rhythm to Kaveri's kindness that made it feel less like charity and more like breathing. She simply couldn't help it, and yet, and this detail would matter more than anyone realized at the time, there was a part of Kaveri that stayed folded away, private, guarded even from her own son. One afternoon, a neighbor named Sushila, who had known Kaveri since before Arjun was born, sat with her on the veranda drinking tea, and Kaveri said something strange, something Sushila only remembered clearly after everything came out. "My son doesn't know everything I did for him," Kaveri said, staring out at the garden, her voice soft in a way that made it sound like she was talking to herself more than to Sushila. "It's better that way. Some things a mother carries alone. If he ever finds out, I hope he understands why I stayed quiet. I hope he doesn't hate me for it." "Hate you, Kaveri? That boy would never." "Everyone says that," Kaveri interrupted gently, "until the truth arrives at the wrong time." Sushila hadn't understood the comment then. She'd assumed Kaveri meant something small, an old debt, an old argument, the ordinary secrets every mother keeps from her children. She hadn't thought to ask more, and Kaveri hadn't offered more, and the conversation drifted back to the price of vegetables and the heat of the coming summer. It was only 3 years later, when Arjun showed up at Sushila's door holding a letter with trembling hands, asking questions no one had asked in years, that Sushila finally understood her old friend had been carrying something enormous. There was another memory Sushila carried, one she would only share with Arjun much later, after the truth had already begun spilling out in every direction. A few months before Kaveri's death, she had come to visit Sushila unannounced, later in the evening than was her habit, and had sat quietly on the veranda for a long time without speaking. "Sushila," she'd finally said, "if something happens to me suddenly, and my son ever asks you whether I was happy, tell him yes, tell him I was happy, even the parts he doesn't know about, especially those." "Kaveri, you're frightening me. Is something wrong?" "No," Kaveri had said, patting her friend's hand gently, "nothing is wrong. I have simply learned, at my age, that happiness and secrecy can live in the same heart without canceling each other out. I found something I thought I had lost forever. I am grateful for it, even if I never get to say so out loud to the people who matter most." Sushila hadn't understood then that Kaveri was speaking about Radha, about a daughter returned to her after decades of aching absence, about a joy so private and so fraught with old shame that she couldn't bring herself to share it even with her own son. She had simply nodded, held her friend's hand, and let the strange, heavy moment pass, the way old friends often let each other's mysteries pass without demanding explanation. Something that had died with her, except it hadn't died at all. It had been waiting, in 4 letters, for the right moment to surface, and that moment had arrived, not because Kaveri chose it, but because, after 3 years of silence, someone had finally decided the truth had waited long enough. If you had asked anyone in Arjun Malhotra's social circle to describe his wife, they would have used words like devoted, graceful, the perfect partner for a man like him. Mira Malhotra hosted flawless dinners, remembered the names of every employee's spouse, and had, by all outward appearances, spent 11 years of marriage, making sure her husband never had to worry about a single domestic detail while he built his empire. She was, in the beginning, exactly that. When Arjun met her, he was already wealthy but still learning how to carry wealth without losing himself in it. And Mira, poised, educated, raised in a family that understood old money, even if her own branch of it had thinned over the years, seemed to steady him. She managed his calendar, his household, his mother's care, his public image, with a competence that made his life run so smoothly he rarely had to ask how it was being done. He simply trusted that it was being done well. That trust, over 11 years, had calcified into something Arjun never questioned. And it was in that unquestioned space that small things began, quietly, to happen. It started years before his mother's death, in ways so minor no one, not Arjun, not the household staff, not even Mira herself perhaps, could have called them cruel at the time. There was the phone call, 3 years ago, from the village where Kaveri had gone to stay with her sister for a few weeks of rest. Mira took the call. Arjun was in the middle of closing the biggest acquisition of his career that week, and Mira, holding the phone, made a decision she would later describe as protecting him from distraction at a critical moment. It was nothing urgent, she told him that evening, when he asked if anyone had called. "Your mother's sister, just checking in. I told her you were busy and would call back." He never called back. Mira never reminded him. The call, as it turned out, had not been nothing. There were other things too, small, deniable, the kind of thing that only becomes visible in hindsight, arranged like dominoes only after the first one has already fallen. A locked drawer in Mira's study that Arjun had noticed once, years ago, and joked about. "What's in there, treasure?" he'd teased, tapping the drawer. Something flickered across Mira's face, quick, almost imperceptible, gone before he could name it. "Old paperwork," she said, already turning away. "Boring things. You'd fall asleep reading it." He had laughed and let it go. The way you let go of 1,000 small moments in a marriage because questioning every locked drawer would mean questioning the entire foundation of trust a relationship is built on. He had no reason back then to think his wife was capable of the kind of quiet, sustained concealment that was slowly becoming visible now, letter by letter, 3 years too late. Mira was not a woman who screamed or threw things or humiliated people in public. Her control was subtler than that. A redirected phone call here, a locked drawer there, a story told just convincingly enough that questioning it felt paranoid rather than reasonable. She had built, without her husband ever noticing the architecture of it, an entire version of the last years of Kaveri's life that Arjun had accepted as fact. He believed his mother had died peacefully in a village clinic, surrounded by familiar faces, without pain, without fear, because his wife had told him so, with tears in her own eyes that made the story impossible to doubt. There was one more moment, small and easily forgotten at the time, that would only make sense much later. A year before Kaveri's death, at a family dinner, Kaveri had mentioned, almost casually, that she wanted to update her will to include a small provision for someone very dear to her, outside the immediate family. Mira had smiled warmly, refilled her mother-in-law's water glass, and said, "Of course, Ma, whatever you feel is right. It's your money to do with as you wish." But later that same night, alone with her own lawyer on the phone, Mira had asked a very different question: how difficult it would be, under Indian succession law, to contest a will that included an unnamed or newly disclosed heir, and how long such a contest could realistically be delayed in court. She never followed through on filing anything. She didn't need to. Kaveri died before any formal changes to her modest estate were finalized, and the question quietly resolved itself. But the phone call had happened, logged and time-stamped, sitting in a legal firm's billing records for anyone patient enough to eventually go looking. Arjun was about to become exactly that patient. He was about to learn that grief, when it is handed to you by someone you trust completely, can be the most effective lie ever told. Arjun did not go looking for his wife immediately. He sat alone in his office for nearly 40 minutes, letter 5 open on the desk in front of him, running through 11 years of marriage like a man searching a house he thought he knew for a door he'd never noticed before. When he finally walked into Mira's study, she was on a video call about the gala centerpieces, laughing lightly at something the florist said. She looked up when he entered, and her smile, the same warm, easy smile she always gave him, faltered for just a fraction of a second when she saw his face. "I'll call you back," she said into the phone, and ended the call without waiting for a response. "Arjun, what's wrong?" He placed the letter on her desk without a word, watched her face as she picked it up. Watched, very specifically, for the moment recognition would cross it, because if she truly had never seen anything like this before, her confusion would look one particular way, and if she had seen it before, it would look different, smaller, guarded. It was the second one. "Where did this come from?" she asked, and her voice was doing something he'd never heard it do before, reaching for casual and missing. "A courier. This morning. It's the 5th letter, Mira. My mother wrote 5 letters. This is the only one I've ever seen." He kept his voice level, watching her. "It says I should ask you where the other 4 are." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it stretched long enough for Arjun to feel something inside his chest quietly, permanently shift. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mira said finally. "I've never seen any letters, Arjun. Your mother never gave me anything to hold for you." "Never? Never." He wanted to believe her. 11 years of marriage had built a reflex in him that wanted, more than anything, to accept her word and move on. To let this be some strange administrative error, a scam, a mistake. But something in the way she'd set the letter down, too carefully, too precisely, like a woman placing a live wire back on a table, told him the reflex was wrong this time. "Mira, look at me. My mother has been dead for 3 years, and this letter was postmarked 2 weeks ago. Someone sent it, someone who knows things about our family that we've never discussed publicly. If you know anything, I don't." Her voice sharpened, just slightly, just enough. "I don't know why you're looking at me like I'm on trial. I loved your mother, Arjun. I took care of everything when she got sick. I sat with her. I arranged the funeral while you were flying back from Singapore. I did everything so you wouldn't have to carry that weight on top of your grief. And now you're standing here accusing me of hiding letters from a dead woman?" It was, he had to admit, a compelling defense. She had done all of those things. He had watched her do them, exhausted with gratitude at the time, thinking himself lucky to have a wife who managed the unbearable, so he didn't have to. But that was exactly what troubled him now. She had managed everything. Every detail of his mother's final months had passed through Mira's hands before it ever reached his. He had never once spoken to a doctor directly. He had never seen a hospital bill. He had never even seen his mother's body before the cremation. Mira had told him it would be better, gentler on his memory, to remember her as she was in life. He had agreed, grieving and grateful, and had never once thought to ask why that decision had been made for him rather than by him. "I'm not accusing you of anything yet," he said quietly, which was, in its own way, the most damning thing he could have said because both of them heard the word yet land in the room and stay there. "I'm going to find out where these letters came from, and I need you to think very carefully, Mira, about whether there's anything at all, you haven't told me." She held his gaze for a long moment. "There's nothing," she said. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door, unable to resist one more question. "Mira, when my mother died, you told me she went peacefully, in her sleep, at the village clinic, with your hand in hers. Was any part of that true?" Mira's silence lasted just a beat too long. "Some of it," she said finally. "Which part?" "Arjun, please, can we not do this tonight?" "Which part, Mira?" She looked down at her hands. "She was not alone," she said carefully. "That much is true. But I wasn't the one holding her hand." The sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he understood. If Mira hadn't been the one at his mother's side in her final moments, then who had? He didn't ask the question aloud. He wasn't ready yet for the answer. And some instinct told him Mira wasn't ready to give it either. Not honestly. Not that night. He left the study without responding further. He didn't believe her, and for the first time in 11 years, he let himself sit with that disbelief instead of talking himself out of it. Behind him, alone in her study, Mira Malhotra picked the letter back up, read the single line on it twice, and then walked to a bookshelf, moved aside a row of decorative volumes, and checked, quickly, quietly, that a small brass key was still exactly where she'd hidden it. It was, for now. Arjun did not sleep that night. He lay awake beside a wife he had trusted completely 12 hours earlier, staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory of his mother's final year, searching for cracks he had walked past without seeing. By 6 in the morning, he was in his car, headed not to his office but to the household staff quarters at the back of the property, to speak with the one person in his life who had never had a single reason to lie to him, Devika, who had worked in his mother's kitchen, and then in his own household for nearly 15 years. Devika was folding laundry when he found her, and something about the set of her shoulders when she saw his face told him she already knew, in some vague and dreaded way, that this conversation had been coming for a long time. "Sir," she said carefully, "is everything all right? I got a letter from my mother yesterday, written before she died, sent to me 2 weeks ago." He watched her face closely. "There are 4 more letters I've never seen, Devika. My mother said someone would have to tell me the truth. I think you know something." Devika set down the shirt she'd been folding. Her hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly. "Sir, I've wanted to say something for 3 years, but it wasn't my place. I'm just staff. If I accuse Madam of something and I'm wrong, you won't lose your job, Devika. I promise you that. Whatever you tell me, I need the truth. Please." She took a long breath. "The week your mother passed, sir, I saw Madam in the garden, very early, before anyone else was awake. She was burning papers in the old incinerator, the one we stopped using years ago because you said it wasn't good for the air. I thought it was strange, so I didn't say anything. I just watched from the kitchen window. She burned for almost 20 minutes. I saw pages, sir, handwritten pages. I couldn't read what was on them, but I remember thinking, who writes 20 minutes worth of pages just to burn them all at 6 in the morning? Arjun felt something cold settle into his stomach. "Why didn't you tell me?" "You were grieving, sir, and Madam is Madam. What proof did I have? A woman burning papers in a garden? That's nothing, unless someone tells you what to look for." "I didn't know what to look for. I still don't, not really. I just know it felt wrong, and it's felt wrong for 3 years, and I've carried it because I didn't know what else to do with it." He thanked her, told her again that she had nothing to fear, and drove straight to his office instead of going home. He needed records, not memories. Memories could be argued with, records could not. By mid-morning, sorting through 3 years of household financial documents with a forensic focus he had never applied to his own domestic life, he found it. A courier service receipt, dated the week of his mother's death, for a package sent from a hospital in the city, not the village clinic he'd always been told, addressed to Mira Malhotra, not to him, to her. He stared at that single line of text for a long time. A hospital in the city, not a village clinic 300 kilometers away. The city he lived in, the city where he could have visited his mother in 20 minutes if anyone had told him she was there. He called the courier company directly, using the tone of a man who owned enough of the country's infrastructure that customer service representatives did not ask too many questions about why a client wanted historical delivery records. Within an hour someone called him back. "Sir, we found the records you asked about. There were 4 packages sent to that address over a period of 8 months, all signed for by Amira Malhotra, and the 5th was scheduled for delayed delivery, set to go out automatically if no cancellation request was received within 3 years of the sender's specified date. That's the one that went out 2 weeks ago. 4 packages, 8 months, signed for by his wife, every single time. His mother had been sending him letters for 8 months before she died, and his wife had been receiving every one of them, and had told him nothing. He drove home with a fury he had never experienced in his adult life, the kind of anger that made his hands shake on the steering wheel. And when he confronted Mira that evening, laying the courier records on the dining table between them like evidence at a trial, something in her composure finally, visibly, cracked. "Fine," she said, her voice breaking. "Fine, I hid 1 letter, just 1, Arjun. I swear to you, just 1. I was trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From something you didn't need to carry. That's not your decision to make about my own mother's words to me. I know that now," she shouted back, tears spilling over. "I know, but I made the decision 3 years ago, when you were breaking down over her death, and I genuinely thought, Arjun, that some things are kinder left unsaid. Where is it? Where is the letter?" She wouldn't tell him, not that night, not with the courier receipts on the table between them and 11 years of marriage cracking open at the seams. She said only that she needed time, that it wasn't as simple as handing over a piece of paper, that there were things attached to that letter that would change how he saw everything. His marriage, his company, his entire family. He didn't sleep in their bedroom that night. He took a blanket to the study on the ground floor, the one that had been his father's when the family first moved into this house, and lay awake staring at bookshelves he had never once thought to search. The next morning, still raw from the confrontation, he found himself talking to the old family driver, Ramesh, a quiet man who had ferried Kaveri to countless appointments over the years and rarely spoke, unless spoken to first. Ramesh, 3 years ago, in the months before my mother passed, where did you used to drive her? Was it always to the village? To her sister's house? Ramesh hesitated, glancing toward the house as though checking whether anyone was watching from a window. Sir, forgive me. I only drive where I am told to drive. But there were times, in her last months, when I was told to take her to the city hospital instead of the village, and I was told very clearly by Madam not to mention it in the household diary. I assumed it was private, sir, a woman's health matters. I didn't think it was my place to ask why it was a secret. Did anyone else know? Did you ever drive anyone else to visit her there? Ramesh nodded slowly. Once or twice, sir, I drove a young woman to that hospital. Madam gave me her details separately, told me to pick her up from a metro station, never from a house address. I never learned her name. She always sat quietly in the back and thanked me softly when she got out. I assume she was a relative from your mother's side, someone from the village perhaps. Another confirmation, another thread pulling loose from the same tapestry of concealment. Somewhere in the house, in a locked drawer behind a row of decorative books, 4 letters sat waiting, and Meera Malhotra sat awake beside them, trying to calculate how much longer she could keep the truth contained before it finally, inevitably broke free. He gave her 3 days. On the 4th morning, when Meera still hadn't produced the letter, Arjun stopped waiting for his wife's permission to know his own mother's dying words. He hired someone, quietly, discreetly, a former investigator his legal team had used once for a corporate dispute, not to spy on Meera in any dramatic sense, but simply to trace the paper trail his wife refused to hand over. Within 2 days, the investigator returned with a manila folder that would unravel everything Arjun believed about the last months of his mother's life. The first letter, retrieved through the courier company's archived digital scans, was dated 8 months before Kaveri's death. Arjun read it alone in his office, door locked, and felt something inside his chest fold in on itself. My son, I have been unwell for some time now. The doctors have given me a name for it that I don't want to write down, because writing it down makes it true. I asked Meera to bring you to see me. She said you were too busy with the big deal, that it would only worry you, that I should rest and not think about troubling you until things were more certain. I believed her. I am asking again in this letter, in case the first request never reached you. Please come, Beta. I don't need you to fix anything. I just want to see your face. Arjun sat with that letter for nearly an hour, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. His mother had known she was dying for 8 months. She had begged to see him, and someone had decided on his behalf that he was too busy for his own mother's final request. The second letter, dated 4 months later, delivered a blow that was somehow sharper. I am writing from the hospital now, my son. Not the village clinic. I never went back there. I am in the city, closer to you than you know, though I don't think you know I am here at all. Someone has been paying for my care, quietly, without ever telling me who. The hospital says the payments come through each month like clockwork, more than I could ever repay in a lifetime, and I don't know who to thank. I only know it isn't you, because you don't know I'm here. An anonymous payer. Arjun immediately requested the hospital's billing records, using every ounce of influence his name carried, and by evening, he had a shell account number responsible for the payments. An account linked, according to the bank's compliance department, to Meera Malhotra. But something about the numbers didn't add up. The payments were substantial, more than Meera's known personal accounts, which he had never scrutinized before, because why would he, could reasonably sustain? Where had that money actually come from? He didn't have time to sit with that question, because the investigator had uncovered something else. A name. A nurse, still working at the same hospital, who had cared for Kaveri during her final months. Arjun drove to the hospital that same evening and found the nurse, a soft-spoken woman named Latha, finishing her shift. Your mother, Latha said once he'd explained who he was, her expression softening with genuine sympathy, was one of the kindest patients I ever cared for. She used to worry about us more than herself, asked if we'd eaten, if we were tired. She paused. She had a visitor every single week, sir. Regular as anything. We all noticed because most patients that sick don't have someone come every week without fail. My wife? Latha frowned slightly as if trying to match a description. No, sir, I don't think so. This woman was younger. We never learned her full name. Your mother just called her Dee. Elder sister, though I always assumed it was affectionate, not literal, since your mother never mentioned having a daughter. Arjun felt the ground shift beneath him for the second time in a week. She doesn't have a daughter, he said slowly. I'm an only child. Leifa only shrugged, kind but firm in her memory. I'm only telling you what I saw, sir. This woman came every week, sat with her for hours, held her hand. Your mother lit up every time she walked in. If she wasn't a daughter, sir, she was something very close to one. Arjun left the hospital with more questions than he'd arrived with, and one name, a nickname, really nothing more, burning at the center of all of them. Didi. Who was she? Why had his mother trusted a stranger with her final months more than she'd trusted her own son to even know she was dying? And why, in 11 years of marriage and 38 years of life, had no one, not his mother, not his wife, not a single relative, ever mentioned that this woman existed at all? He went back to the hospital records one more time that night, this time asking specifically for visitor logs rather than billing information. The security desk had kept handwritten sign-in sheets for that entire wing, an old-fashioned practice that had, by sheer luck, never been digitized or discarded. Flipping through months of faded ink, Arjun found the same signature appearing week after week, every single Thursday afternoon, in handwriting that was careful and slightly cramped. Nothing like his mother's flowing script, nothing like Mira's polished cursive either. The signature read simply, R. Verma, not Radha Malhotra, not any name connected, at least on paper, to his family at all. Whoever this woman was, she had been careful, deliberately, consistently careful, to leave no trace that could connect her visits back to the Malhotra name. He sat in his car outside the hospital for nearly 20 minutes, staring at that signature, feeling the shape of an enormous secret pressing up against the edges of his understanding without yet fully revealing itself. Someone had cared for his dying mother more faithfully, more consistently than he himself had managed to in her final year. And that someone had gone to considerable lengths to remain invisible. He didn't yet know why. He was about to find out that the answer had been hiding in his own family's history for nearly 4 decades. The answer arrived in the third letter, and it arrived with a force that made Arjun grip the edge of his desk as he read it, as though the words themselves might knock him backward out of his chair. My son, there is something I should have told you decades ago, and I let cowardice keep me quiet for far too long. Before I married your father, I was very young, barely 19, and I had a daughter. Circumstances then were not what they are now. My family would not accept a child born before marriage, and I was made to give her up for adoption. I never stopped thinking of her, not for a single day of my life, but I told myself it was a closed chapter, a sign of I would carry alone and never burden you with. Her name is Radha. She found me 4 years ago, on her own, after years of searching. I did not tell you because I did not know how, and because I feared what you would think of me. She is your sister, Arjun, your older sister, the woman the nurses call Didi. She has been paying for parts of my care without ever asking me to thank her, because she said that was never the point. She only wanted to know her mother before it was too late. I am asking you now, in case I never find the courage to say it aloud. Please, when I am gone, find her, know her, let her be family, not a secret. Arjun read the letter 4 times before the words fully settled into something his mind could process. A sister. He had an older sister, a woman who had been quietly funding his mother's medical care for years, sitting beside her hospital bed every single week, while he, the son, the one everyone assumed had done everything right, had no idea she existed at all. He thought of every family gathering, every conversation about family his mother had ever had with him, and understood now that an entire chapter of her life had been folded away and hidden, not out of malice, but out of a shame she had carried silently for nearly 4 decades. Before confronting her, he made one more call to the bank compliance officer handling the Shell account records, and asked where the funds feeding that account actually originated. The answer, when it came back that afternoon, deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The money moving through the account tied loosely to Mira in fact traced back further, to a separate individual account under the name R. Verma. The same surname from the hospital's visitor logs, so Didi hadn't only been visiting his mother every week. She had also, quietly, been helping fund a portion of her care, money that appeared to pass first through channels connected to his own wife, before ever reaching the hospital, as though the two of them, in some strange and unspoken arrangement, had both been managing pieces of the same secret, without either fully explaining it to him. He confronted Mira again that night, letter in hand, and this time she didn't try to deny knowing. I've known about Radha since before our wedding. Mira admitted quietly, sitting across from him, her earlier defiance replaced now with something closer to exhaustion. Your mother told me herself, years ago, in confidence. She made me promise never to tell you until she felt the time was right. She said it wasn't my secret to give away. And you kept that promise for 11 years, even after she died? Even when you had every opportunity to finally tell me the truth? I thought I was honoring her wishes. You were honoring your own comfort, Arjun said, his voice low and cold in a way that frightened even him. Because if I had a sister, Mira, that meant a sister who might one day have a claim on this family, on this company, on everything we've built. And you decided quietly on your own that it was safer for everyone if she simply stayed a secret. Mira didn't answer. Her silence was answer enough. For the first time since the letters had begun arriving, Arjun understood that this wasn't only about hidden grief or a mother's shame from decades ago. This was about money and power and a wife who had spent years quietly managing not just his household, but the entire architecture of who was allowed to be considered family. He had a sister. She was real, she was alive, and somewhere out there she believed her own brother had never once tried to find her. That night, unable to sleep, Arjun found himself pulling out old family photo albums, the physical kind his mother had insisted on keeping even after everyone else in the family had switched entirely to digital photos. He flipped through decades of images, his own childhood, his father's younger years, his mother's wedding photos, faded and slightly yellowed at the edges. Near the back of one album, tucked into a sleeve that seemed to have been added later, not part of the original binding, he found a single black and white photograph of a much younger Kavari, no older than 19 or 20, holding an infant wrapped in a simple cotton cloth. There was no caption, no date written on the back, just his mother's face, achingly young, looking down at the baby with an expression of love so total and so private that Arjun felt, looking at it decades later, like he was intruding on a moment that had never been meant for anyone else's eyes. He understood now why the photograph had been hidden. His mother had carried this image, carried this entire chapter of her life, in complete secrecy for nearly 40 years, unwilling or unable to let it exist in the open even within her own family's shared history. He intended to fix that immediately. He had no idea how much harder that would prove to be. Finding Radha should have been simple for a man with Arjun's resources. It was not. Mira claimed she had no way to reach her, that Radha had cut off all contact 18 months earlier, shortly after Kaveri's death, and had never explained why. For the first time in the entire ordeal, Arjun believed his wife was telling him the truth on this particular point, if only because the alternative made no sense. If Mira had wanted to control the narrative, keeping a direct line to Radha open would have served her far better than losing track of her entirely. He asked his head of HR to personally pull employment records for anyone who had joined the company around the time his mother's illness had begun and left within the window surrounding her death, cross-referenced loosely against age and location, aware that he was searching for a woman he had never seen a photograph of, based on nothing more than a nickname and a hospital sign-in sheet. It felt, for 2 days, like searching for a single specific grain of sand on a very large beach. Then his HR director called him personally, her voice careful in the way people's voices get when they suspect they've found something significant and are unsure how their employer will react to it. Sir, I think I found her. There's a former analyst, Radha Verma, who joined the Data Insights team a little over 3 years ago and resigned unexpectedly. Her file has a flag on it I've never seen before. An unfiled grievance document that was scanned into the system but never formally submitted through the proper channel. I don't know how it ended up attached to her exit paperwork instead. It might be nothing, but given what you asked me to look for, I thought you should see it immediately. Verma, the same surname from the hospital sign-in sheet. Arjun felt his pulse quicken as he asked her to send the file directly, encrypted to his personal email, no copies retained elsewhere. Not yet, not until he understood exactly what he was looking at. He put his own investigator on the search as well, running parallel to the HR discovery, and what came back 4 days later stunned him more than anything the letters had revealed so far. Radha had not been a stranger to his life at all. Under a different surname, her adoptive family's name, she had worked inside Arjun's own company for nearly 2 years, in a mid-level analytics role several floors below his office, close enough that they had likely passed each other in the elevator, in the cafeteria, in the parking garage, without either of them knowing what the other one was. She had resigned the same week his mother died. Her official resignation letter cited personal reasons, a phrase so common in HR files that no one had ever flagged it as unusual. But attached to her personnel file, Buried and never formally submitted was something else entirely. A complaint, drafted but never filed, alleging that she had witnessed financial irregularities inside the company involving vendor contracts connected to Mira's brother Sanjay. Arjun sat with that document for a long time, the pieces of an entirely separate betrayal beginning to assemble themselves in front of him. His sister had worked in his own company, silently watching him from a distance for 2 years, had discovered evidence of fraud connected to his wife's family, and had walked away without ever confronting him. The same week their mother died, the same week, Arjun now suspected that she had learned something devastating enough to make her disappear entirely. He pulled the company's audit trail himself that night, going back 3 years, cross-referencing every vendor contract connected in any way to Sanjay's name. What he found made his blood run cold in a completely different way than the letters had. Sanjay had been siphoning money through inflated and partially fictitious vendor contracts for over 3 years. A slow, careful bleed of funds routed through shell companies and padded invoices, small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic audit flags, but adding up, over 3 years, to a sum that made Arjun's stomach turn. And there, in letter 4, waiting for him like the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was assembling, was confirmation that his mother had discovered this fraud months before she died, and had confronted Mira about it not out of anger, but out of fear for the company her son had built with his own bleeding hands and her own sold gold bangles. "I found something in papers Sanjay left carelessly at the house one evening, my son. I am not a clever woman with numbers, but I know enough to see when something doesn't add up. I told Mira. She promised me she would handle it quietly, that she would speak to her brother and make sure it stopped, that there was no need to trouble you while you were so busy with the company's expansion. I believed her, because I wanted to believe her, because the alternative, that my daughter-in-law might protect her own family over yours, was too painful to accept. I pray by the time you read this it has already been fixed. If it has not, I am sorry, my son. I should have come to you directly. I was afraid of causing trouble in your marriage. I did not want to be the mother-in-law who destroys a family with suspicion. I see now that silence can destroy just as easily." Arjun set the letter down with hands that would not stop shaking. His mother had known. 2 years before her death, she had known about the fraud, had trusted Mira to fix it, and Mira had promised her it would be handled, and then the fraud had continued for 2 more years, right under his own roof, right under his own name. While his wife stood beside him at galas and charity dinners and told the world what a devoted, honest family they were, the betrayal was no longer singular. It was layered: his mother's dying wish, his sister's silent presence, his company's stolen money. All of it braided together by one woman's decision, over and over again, to protect her own comfort over the truth. He called 2 senior members of his finance team the next morning, without telling them why, and asked them to quietly compile every contract Sanjay's name had ever touched, going back to the year he first joined as a vendor relations consultant. A position, Arjun now recalled uncomfortably, that Mira had personally recommended him for, years ago, describing her brother as brilliant with numbers, just needs a chance. The finance team returned within 36 hours with a spreadsheet that made Arjun's jaw tighten with every scrawling line. Contracts with vendors that, on closer inspection, shared registered addresses with residential apartments. Invoices for consulting services with no corresponding deliverables on file. Payment approvals that had been rushed through during weeks when Arjun himself had been traveling internationally, unavailable for the kind of casual oversight he usually applied to large expenditures. It wasn't reckless, it was patient. Someone had studied the company's approval systems carefully enough to know exactly which cracks to slip through, and for exactly how long each individual theft could remain small enough to avoid triggering scrutiny. He thought of every family dinner where Sanjay had sat across the table, laughing easily, asking about the business with what Arjun had always assumed was harmless brotherly curiosity. He thought of the vacations they'd taken together, the golf games, the small loans Arjun had cheerfully written off over the years as keeping it in the family. He no longer wondered whether he could trust his wife. He wondered how deep the lie actually went, and whether there was anything left in his marriage, or his company, or his family, that hadn't been touched by it. Arjun spent the next 2 days doing something he had never done in 11 years of marriage, treating his own home like a case to be solved, rather than a place to feel safe. He started with the phone, among his mother's belongings, returned to the house after her death, and never properly gone through, because grief at the time had made the task feel unbearable, was an old mobile phone, cracked screen, barely functional. He had assumed it was empty, a relic. He was wrong. A technician he trusted managed to recover a single voice memo file from the device, dated roughly a year before Kaveri's death, nearly 18 minutes long. Arjun listened to it alone, late at night, headphones in, his mother's voice filling his ears for the first time in 3 years, and then, unmistakably, Mira's voice joining hers. His mother must have recorded it accidentally, the phone likely tucked in a bag or pocket during what was clearly meant to be a private conversation. The audio was imperfect, muffled in places, but the words that came through clearly were enough. "If you tell him, you'll destroy this family," Mira's voice said, tight with something that sounded even through the recording like genuine fear. "Let me fix it my way, please, Ma, trust me. I will fix Sanjay's mess, I promise you, but if Arjun finds out now, in the middle of everything he's building, it could destroy the company and the marriage both. Give me time." His mother's voice, softer, uncertain. "How much time, Beta? I am not well. I don't have unlimited time to wait for you to fix things quietly. I know, I'm handling it. Please don't tell him yet." Arjun sat with the recording playing on a loop for nearly an hour. His mother's plea and his wife's fear tangled together in a conversation that had happened without him, about him, deciding the shape of his own life without his knowledge or consent. The investigator found a second recording 2 days later, buried deeper in the phone's storage, damaged but partially recoverable, and this one was worse. In it, Mira's voice, sharper, more controlled, revealed something Arjun had not anticipated even after everything else he'd learned. "You don't understand what's at stake for me, Ma. Sanjay isn't just my brother. He knows things about my life before Arjun. A debt. A mistake I made years ago that I never told your son about. If I expose him now, he'll expose me too, and I will lose everything. Please, let me handle this my way." Arjun stopped the recording. Played it again. A debt. A mistake. Something from before their marriage that Mira had never disclosed. Something significant enough that her own brother could use it as leverage to keep her silent about his fraud for years. He didn't yet know what that old debt was, but he understood, with sudden and total clarity, the shape of the trap his wife had been living inside for years, protecting her brother not entirely out of loyalty, but out of fear, blackmailed into silence by a man who knew something about her past that could unravel her entire carefully built present. It did not excuse what she had done, but it began, for the first time, to explain it. And Arjun found himself, even in his anger, unable to fully hate a woman who had clearly spent years trapped inside a fear she'd never found the courage to name out loud to anyone, including herself. He made a note to eventually find out exactly what old debt Sanjay had been holding over his wife. Not out of malice, but because he suspected, correctly, that understanding it would matter later, when the time came to decide what, if anything, could still be salvaged from his marriage. There was one more secret waiting, and it was Devika, once again, who delivered it, quietly, apologetically, as though she had been holding this particular piece for the longest of all, and dreaded finally setting it down. "Sir, there's something else. About a month before your mother passed, Madam went to visit her. Just once, in all that time. I know because I overheard her telling the driver where to go, and it wasn't a hospital visit she ever mentioned to you afterward." Devika hesitated. "It wasn't a kind visit, sir. I wasn't in the room, but I was in the hallway outside, and I heard raised voices. Madam was asking your mother to stop trying to reach out to Radha, telling her to stay out of things. Your mother was crying by the time Madam left." Arjun closed his eyes. His mother, dying, isolated in a hospital his own wife had chosen to keep secret from him, had also been pressured in her final weeks to stop reaching for the one other child she had left in the world, because that daughter's presence threatened something Mira was desperate to protect. He had one letter left. Letter 4, already partially read for its revelations about the fraud, held one final paragraph he had not yet let himself absorb, because some part of him had been avoiding the ending, afraid of what closure might finally cost him. That night, alone, he read it. "I don't want revenge, my son. I never wanted revenge for anything in my whole life. I just wanted my children to know each other before I was gone. That was all. Not money, not inheritance, not proof of anything. Just two people who came from me, sitting in the same room, calling each other brother and sister at least once before I closed my eyes for the last time. Don't let money decide who is family, Arjun. Promise me that. Whatever else happens, whatever you learn, whoever has lied to you, don't let money be the thing that decides who deserves to be loved." Arjun sat alone in the dark for a long time after that, the letter resting in his lap, and for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, he cried. Not from anger, but from the specific, unbearable grief of understanding, finally, completely, what his mother had actually wanted. and how thoroughly everyone around her, himself included, had failed to give it to her while she was still alive to receive it. He thought about calling Mira into the room right then, at nearly 2 in the morning, and confronting her with everything all at once. He decided against it, not out of mercy, but out of a need to be certain of every fact, every document, every recording, before he allowed this conversation to happen only once, completely, without leaving room for further concealment or partial confession. He spent the rest of that night writing everything down in order. The 5 letters, the courier records, the hospital visitor logs, the 2 recordings, the audit trail, Radha's unfiled complaint, Devika's account of the burned papers, and the unkind visit. By the time the sun rose, he had assembled what amounted to a complete timeline of 3 years of hidden truth, laid out with the same discipline he had once used to build an entire company out of a one-room shop. He wiped his eyes, folded the letter carefully, and made a decision. Tomorrow, the hiding would end. All of it. For everyone. Arjun called the family lawyer the next morning and asked him to be present at the house that evening, along with Mira, and separately, Sanjay. He did not explain why. He simply said the word urgent in a tone the lawyer had never heard him use before. And the lawyer, who had known Arjun for over a decade, cleared his entire evening without asking a second question. Mira knew, the moment she walked into the drawing room and saw the lawyer already seated, files stacked neatly on the coffee table, that whatever was coming could no longer be managed with a locked drawer or a carefully worded excuse. Arjun did not raise his voice. That somehow made it worse. He laid the letters out on the table in order, 1 through 5, followed by the courier receipts, the hospital billing records, the HR file with Radha's unfiled complaint, the audit trail on Sanjay's vendor contracts, and finally a small speaker connected to his phone. "I want you to hear something," he said quietly, and pressed play. The room listened in silence as his mother's voice, frail but clear, filled the space, followed by Mira's own voice pleading for time, for silence, for the chance to fix it my way. When the second recording played, the one mentioning Sanjay's leverage over her, the old debt from before their marriage, Mira's face went the color of ash. "Everyone in this room," Arjun said when the recording finished, "is going to hear the truth tonight, all of it. No more locked drawers." Mira did not try to lie again. Something in her seemed to finally give way, the way a dam gives way not all at once, but in a single decisive crack that makes the rest inevitable. "I was scared," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "Not just of Sanjay's threat. I was scared of Radha, Arjun. The moment your mother told me she had another child, I felt something I'm ashamed of even now. I felt like I was about to lose my place. My place in this family, my place as the woman who managed everything, who was needed for everything. If Radha showed up, if she and your mother grew close, if you found her and loved her the way you love your own blood, I was afraid there would be less room for me. That's not a good reason. I know that. But it's the true one, and you deserve the true one after everything I've taken from you. You didn't just take a sister from me," Arjun said, his voice finally rising, 11 years of blind trust breaking apart in real time. "You took my mother's last months. You let her die believing her own son didn't care enough to come see her, when the truth is, I never knew there was anywhere to go. You let her beg her daughter-in-law to stop reaching for her only other child. You let my company bleed money for 2 more years because exposing your brother meant exposing yourself. How much of my life, Mira, was actually real? All of it that mattered," she said quietly. "My love for you was never a lie. Everything else, I was drowning, and I made choices while drowning that I will spend the rest of my life regretting." Sanjay, when confronted separately later that evening in a much shorter, much colder conversation, offered no such emotional confession. He admitted the fraud had started small, a single unpaid personal loan he'd needed years ago, quietly covered through a padded invoice with the intention of paying it back within a month. It had spiraled from there, month after month, because no one had ever stopped him early, and because his sister's silence had made the theft feel, somehow, permissible. "I never meant for it to become what it became," he said, which was, Arjun thought, the closest thing to an apology a man like Sanjay was capable of offering. "You used my sister's silence to keep stealing," Arjun said quietly. "You knew Radha had seen the irregularities. You knew she'd drafted a complaint. And instead of stopping, you let your own sister's fear of exposing her past keep you protected for 2 more years." Sanjay didn't deny it. "Mira asked me to be careful. She never told me to stop entirely, not really. I think some part of her hoped it would just quietly resolve itself if she gave me enough time. It didn't resolve itself, it never does. That's the entire problem with quiet, Sanjay. It just gives rot more time to spread." The lawyer, who had been taking careful notes throughout the evening, finally spoke up. Mr. Malhotra, given what's been disclosed tonight, I'd strongly recommend a formal, independent forensic audit before any further internal action. This needs to be handled by the book, for the company's protection and frankly for yours. Arjun nodded. Start tomorrow morning. Full access, no restrictions, no advance warning to anyone in the finance department. Truth, once it was finally allowed into the room, did not arrive gently. It arrived all at once, in overlapping confessions and recordings and documents that no one could argue with anymore. And by the time the lawyer finally left that night, close to midnight, the entire architecture of the family Arjun believed he had built lay exposed on the coffee table, page by page, in his mother's own careful handwriting. The confrontation that mattered most, in the end, was not the one with lawyers and audit files spread across a coffee table. It was the quiet one that happened 2 days later, when Arjun sat alone with Meera on the veranda where his mother used to drink her tea, and asked her the only question that was left to ask. Do you understand what you actually broke? Meera didn't answer immediately. She had spent 2 days in something close to a fog, moving through the house like a woman waiting for a verdict she knew she deserved. I broke your trust, she said finally. You broke more than that. You decided, over and over, for 3 years, which truths I was allowed to have about my own mother, my own sister, my own company. You didn't just lie to me, Meera. You edited my life without asking, and you let me grieve a version of my mother's death that wasn't even real. I know. I keep trying to understand how the woman who cried at my mother's funeral, real tears I saw them, I held you, is the same woman who kept her dying wishes locked in a drawer. I don't know how to hold both of those things about you at the same time. I don't either, Meera admitted, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, there was no defense in her voice, no careful redirection, only a kind of bare honesty that had clearly cost her everything to reach. I was afraid of losing my place in this family the day I learned Radha existed, and instead of dealing with that fear honestly, I let it turn into control. Control over information, over access, over who got to know what and when. I told myself I was protecting you, but protecting you was never really the point, was it? I was protecting my own fear of becoming less important to you than a mother-in-law's secret daughter. That's an ugly thing to say out loud. It's an uglier thing to have lived. Arjun listened to her without softening, but also without the rage that had carried him through the past week. What remained, sitting across from his wife on his mother's veranda, was something quieter and in its own way, harder to sit with. Grief, for a marriage he had believed was one thing and was learning, slowly, had actually been another. I don't know what happens to us, he said honestly. I'm not going to pretend I have an answer tonight. I'm not asking you to have one, Meera said. I only want you to know that I understand, finally, what I cost you. Not just letters, not just money. Time with your mother that can never come back, and a sister you should have known for years. I can't fix that. I know I can't. All I can do is stop hiding, starting now, for as long as you'll let me try. Why didn't you just tell me, Meera? At any point, even after she died, even after the funeral, you had 3 years where you could have simply sat me down and said, there's something you need to know. Why did it take a letter arriving from beyond the grave to force this out of you? Meera was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over as though she owed him the most honest answer she was capable of giving, even if it wasn't a flattering one. Because every day that passed made it harder than the day before, she said finally. The first week after she died, I told myself I'd tell you once the funeral arrangements were settled. Then I told myself I'd tell you once you were finished grieving. Then months went by, and the longer I waited, the more it felt like telling you wouldn't just reveal one secret. It would reveal that I'd been lying to you, actively, for all that time in between. The secret got heavier the longer I carried it, until I convinced myself it was safer buried than confessed. I know how that sounds. I know it's not an excuse. It's just the truth of how a person talks themselves into cowardice one quiet day at a time. Arjun absorbed that, and something about its honesty, however painful, felt more real to him than any of her earlier explanations had. It wasn't forgiveness. Arjun made that clear, and Meera didn't ask for it. But it was, for the first time since the courier had arrived at the gate a week earlier, an honest conversation between two people who had spent 11 years building something on a foundation neither of them had fully understood the cracks in. The confrontation with Sanjay was shorter, and colder, and entirely without redemption. Arjun met him once more, this time with the company's general counsel present, and simply said, "The board will be informed tomorrow. What happens after that is no longer a family matter. It's a legal one." Sanjay didn't argue. Some men, faced finally with consequences they had outrun for years, simply go quiet. Later that same night, alone in the guest room he had taken to sleeping in, Arjun found himself thinking not about anger, but about the strange, uneven geometry of love inside a family. His mother had loved him enough to sell her only gold for his future, and had also loved a daughter she'd been forced to give away decades earlier, enough to carry that grief silently for most of her life, never once letting it diminish the love she gave her son. Mira had loved him enough to build, by every visible measure, a devoted 11-year marriage, and had also, simultaneously, let fear curdle that love into control, so quiet it had taken a dead woman's letters to finally expose it. He understood, lying awake that night, that people were rarely only one thing. His mother had been loving and secretive at once. His wife had been devoted and controlling at once. Even Sanjay, a man who had stolen from his own family for years, had clearly once been, in some earlier version of himself, simply a younger brother trying to cover an embarrassing debt before it spiraled beyond his control. None of that erased the harm. But it gave Arjun, for the first time since the letters had begun arriving, a way to hold his grief and his anger without either one completely consuming him. Karma, in Arjun Malhotra's story, did not arrive as a lightning bolt. It arrived the way real consequences usually do, slowly, procedurally, and with a kind of quiet inevitability that felt, in its own way, more satisfying than any dramatic collapse could have. Sanjay was formally reported to the company's board within a week. The audit findings, thorough and undeniable, triggered an internal investigation, followed swiftly by a police complaint for financial fraud and criminal breach of trust. The company initiated formal recovery proceedings against him, freezing what assets could be traced, and Sanjay, who had spent 3 years believing his sister's silence made him untouchable, discovered very quickly that a company's willingness to look the other way has limits, and those limits had just been reached. He faced prosecution, the slow grinding machinery of the legal system now turning against a man who had once believed himself clever enough to stay ahead of it forever. Mira's consequences looked different, because Arjun made a deliberate choice not to destroy his family publicly for the sake of a satisfying ending. There was no dramatic divorce announcement, no public humiliation, no arrest. Instead, something quieter and, in its own way, more demanding took its place. Arjun stepped back from the marriage emotionally, moved into the guest wing of the house, and told Mira plainly that whatever future they had, if they had one at all, would have to be rebuilt from nothing, with total transparency, with therapy, with time measured in years rather than apologies measured in evenings. "I'm not leaving today," he told her. "But I'm not staying the way I was either. If you want to earn something back, it starts with never asking me to trust you blindly again. Show me. Every single time, for as long as it takes." Mira agreed, and to her credit, a credit Arjun watched carefully, still guarded, still healing, she began the slow work of rebuilding honestly, attending therapy on her own initiative, disclosing financial records without being asked, personally reaching out to Radha with an apology that made no excuses and asked for nothing in return. There was one more piece of karma that arrived in a form Arjun hadn't expected. When the board learned that the fraud had been discovered and reported by Arjun himself, self-audited, self-disclosed, handled with full transparency rather than concealment, they did not punish him for the scandal happening under his watch. Instead, in a public statement that surprised even his own communications team, the board publicly credited him for the integrity of how he'd handled it, restoring rather than damaging his reputation in the business community. The story that spread wasn't Billionaire's company embroiled in fraud. It was Billionaire uncovers and corrects fraud within his own family, protects shareholders through transparency. His name, rather than being dragged through scandal, emerged from it stronger, a reversal no one, least of all Arjun, had anticipated when this entire nightmare began with a single unexpected letter. The months that followed were slow and unglamorous, and entirely unlike the dramatic reckonings so many people quietly hope for when they imagine karma finally arriving for those who have wronged them. Sanjay's court proceedings dragged on, as such things do, filled with delays and procedural motions, but the outcome, when it finally came, was unambiguous: a conviction, a court-ordered restitution plan, and the quiet, permanent unraveling of the comfortable life he had built on other people's money. Mira's rebuilding was, in its own way, harder to watch, because there was no single dramatic moment where the audience, had there been one, could point and say that's when she paid for what she did. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of small, consistent choices. Therapy sessions she never missed, financial transparency she never resisted. An apology to Radha that she delivered in person, without lawyers present, without any attempt to soften her own responsibility. It took nearly a year before Arjun moved back into their shared bedroom, and even then, he did so cautiously, the way a person tests ice before trusting their full weight on it. Justice, in the end, looked less like punishment and more like consequence, finally catching up to choices that had been allowed to run unchecked for far too long. Sanjay faced the law. Mira faced the long, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust with no guarantee she would succeed. And Arjun faced the hardest task of all, learning to grieve a mother's death all over again, this time with the full truth of what she had actually wanted from him. There was, in the middle of that long and difficult year, one small moment of unexpected grace. Devika, the household staff member whose quiet courage had first cracked open the entire investigation, was promoted by Arjun to oversee the household with full authority and a salary that reflected, at last, the trust she had earned through 15 years of loyalty and one moment of difficult honesty. "You told me the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent," Arjun told her when she tried to protest that the promotion was too generous. "In this family, this year, that has turned out to be worth more than anything money can measure." Devika only nodded, blinking back tears she didn't bother hiding, and returned to her work the way she always had. Quietly, faithfully, asking nothing in return for a kindness she had never expected to receive. He found her on a Tuesday afternoon, standing outside a small government school 2 hours from the city, chalk dust on her fingers, calling out multiplication tables to a classroom of children who had no idea their teacher was the older sister of one of the richest men in the country. Radha turned when she heard footsteps in the school's dusty courtyard, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. She looked like their mother, Arjun realized immediately. Something in the set of her eyes, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was uncertain what to say. "I know who you are," she said quietly before he could speak. "I've known for a long time. I only just found out," Arjun said. "I'm sorry it took this long. I didn't know you existed until 11 days ago. I promise you that." Something in her shoulders relaxed, just slightly, as though she had been carrying a version of this story, one where her brother had known, and simply never bothered, and was only now allowed to set it down. "I never wanted anything from you," Radha said. "Not money, not the company. I gave up any claim to that a long time ago, before I even resigned. I only wanted to know her, and maybe, someday, to know you too. But I didn't know how to walk into that kind of family without it looking like I wanted something. So I stayed quiet instead." "You don't have to stay quiet anymore," Arjun said, and for the first time since the letters had begun arriving, his voice didn't shake with anger or grief. It simply held something steady. "I have 5 letters from our mother. I've read them alone, over and over for the past 2 weeks. I think it's time we read them together, all of them, in order, the way she wrote them." They drove to the small hillside cemetery where Kaveri Malhotra had been laid to rest 3 years earlier, a modest grave beneath a neem tree that Arjun had visited more times than he could count without ever knowing the whole truth of the woman buried beneath it. Radha had visited too, he learned on the drive, quietly, alone, never once telling him, standing at the edge of the same grave from a respectful distance while her own brother stood closer, both of them for years, unknowingly grieving the same woman from opposite sides of a truth neither of them had been given. They sat together in the grass, brother and sister, and Arjun took the 5 letters from his coat pocket, worn now from being read so many times, and began to read them aloud, in order, exactly as their mother had written them, closing a loop that had opened with a shattered coffee cup and a courier at the gate. When he finished the 5th letter, the one that had started everything, Radha was crying, and so, he realized was he. "She never wanted revenge," Arjun said softly, looking at the small stone marker in front of them. "She just wanted this. 2 of her children, sitting together, finally knowing each other's names." "Then I think," Radha said, wiping her eyes and managing, somehow, a small and genuine smile, "we're finally giving her what she asked for, just 3 years late." Arjun reached over and took his sister's hand, the first time in either of their lives that the gesture had ever been possible. And together, in the quiet shade of the neem tree, they sat with their mother a little while longer. No longer strangers, no longer secrets, simply family. Exactly as she had always wanted them to be. Money had once decided, for 3 years, who was allowed to be close to this family, and who was kept at a careful distance. On that hillside, with the truth finally spoken aloud in a mother's own handwriting. Money no longer decided anything at all. Only love did. Late, imperfect, and finally, unmistakably real. They stayed at the grave until the light began to fade, the way people do when they've finally found something they were afraid they'd lost forever, and aren't quite ready to let the moment end. Radha told him small things about their mother that he had never known, how Kaveri had asked, every single visit, whether Arjun was eating properly, whether he was working too hard, whether he seemed happy in his marriage, even in the months when their mother had every reason to be furious at the woman managing that marriage. Even then, even carrying the weight of Mira's silence, Kaveri had never once wished harm on her son's happiness. She had only ever wanted more of it for him, enough if possible to share. She talked about you like you were still a boy sometimes, Radha said, smiling through tears. Even near the end, she'd say, "My son used to skip meals so I could eat. Did you know that? I never told him I knew." She knew, Arjun. All those years, she knew exactly what you were doing, and she let you believe your secret was safe because she understood you needed to believe you were protecting her. Arjun laughed, wet and unsteady, the kind of laugh that arrives folded inside grief rather than separate from it. She never said a word. She was good at that, Radha said, carrying things quietly. I suppose I learned it from her too, without ever meeting her until I was already grown. In the weeks that followed, Arjun established a scholarship in his mother's name at the small school where Radha taught, though he made certain, this time, that every decision about it was made openly, with his sister's full involvement, nothing hidden, nothing decided on anyone's behalf without their knowledge. Radha, for her part, finally accepted a place in the family she had spent years watching from a careful distance, not the inheritance her mother had once wished to formalize, which she still refused outright, but something she valued far more, a standing invitation to Sunday dinners. A nephew and niece she was slowly getting to know, a name that no longer had to hide behind an adoptive surname when she visited her brother's home. Mira attended one of those Sunday dinners, months later, quiet and careful in a way she had never been before, pouring tea for the sister-in-law whose existence she had once tried so hard to keep buried. It was not comfortable. Some wounds, Arjun had come to understand, simply take longer to close than others, and pretending otherwise would only have been one more version of the same old lie. But it was honest. And for a family that had spent 3 years drowning in careful, well-intentioned silence, honest, however uncomfortable, was finally, blessedly, enough. On the anniversary of Kaveri Malhotra's death that year, Arjun didn't go to the office at all. He drove to the hillside grave with Radha beside him, and this time, Mira came too, sitting a respectful distance away, present but not intruding, learning slowly what it meant to hold space for a grief that wasn't entirely hers to lead. Arjun knelt at his mother's grave and spoke to her the way he hadn't allowed himself to in 3 long years. "I found her, Ma," he said quietly. "I found Radha. We know each other now. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions while you were alive. But I promise you, from today, money will never again decide who gets to be loved in this family. You asked me for that once, in a letter I almost didn't get to read. I heard you. I finally heard you." The wind moved gently through the neem tree above them, and for the briefest moment, Arjun could have sworn he felt something settle. Not an answer, not a sign, nothing so dramatic as that. Just a quiet, ordinary peace, the kind his mother had spent her whole life quietly, patiently trying to give him, even from behind a silence that had taken 3 years and 5 letters to finally break.
Moral of the story: the narrative reminds us that family, truth, and love surpass wealth, power, or fame in importance. Arjun became a billionaire as a result of his mother's efforts, but in search of success, he neglected to spend enough time with her. Mira's anxiety of losing her position in the family drove her to cover the truth, therefore creating years of suffering, separation, and misinterpretation from that one act of lying. Though bearing painful secrets, Kaveri just wanted her kids to know and love one another. Eventually, the buried facts surfaced, so showing that although lies could last a time, they never can stay buried permanently. The story reminds us to treasure our parents while they are alive, to tell the truth even when it is uncomfortable, and to never let selfishness, anxiety, or pride determine who merits our love. The biggest gifts anybody may have are honest relationships and time with loved ones.